A very good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to this RSIS seminar. I'm delighted to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Joel Ng. I'm the head of the Center for Multilateralism Studies at RSIS. And today we have quite a treat with Professor Xinbo, who is going to speak to us on pursuing pragmatic multilateralism in a multipolar world. Now, to give you a brief introduction of Professor Wu, he is the professor and dean of the Institute of International Studies and director of the Center for American Studies, Fudan University. He teaches and researches Chinese foreign policy and security policy, Sino-US relations, and US-Asia Pacific policy. He has a very illustrious publication record. I'm not going to read all of his numerous very well-acclaimed books, but he also sits on the editorial board of the Washington Quarterly, European Journal of International Security and International Affairs, all top-tier journals. He's a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Geopolitical Risk and served as its vice chair, and as well as member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Geoeconomics, which is a particularly interesting topic nowadays. Now, this moment in the contemporary world right now, to say that it's an interesting time is a bit of a cliche, really, because we've been in interesting times for several years now. But we can safely say that the return of Donald Trump to the US presidency has raised the stakes, created a lot more uncertainty and a lot more difficulties with adjustment in terms of what it means to come to a multipolar international system. For Professor Wu, he suggests that multilateralism has to be more pragmatic to perhaps temper the major power rivalry and facilitate cooperation among states. This entails an ambitious and progressive agenda anchored by three pillars: a grand bargain between China and the US, a reformed and reinvigorated international system, and constructive roles by key third-party actors such as Europe, Russia, Japan, India, and ASEAN. Now, without further ado, I would like to bring in Professor Wu now to speak on pursuing pragmatic multilateralism in a multipolar world. Professor Wu, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nong, for your kind and very generous introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My topic today is about multilateralism, and I think Singapore is just the terrific place to talk about this topic. If I do this in Washington these days, that means suicide. So it goes nowhere. But anyway, to some extent, we are still very much in the process of moving from unipolarity to multipolarity. Okay, we are in this transitional process. Even though, the multipolarity is not yet in full pledging, but the trend is very clear. So I think today, for any reasonable observers of international affairs, few would doubt that this is no longer a unipolar world. And to some extent, Trump's ascendance in the US reflected this general trend. That is, this is no longer a US-dominated unipolar world. We are in the process of transforming from the unipolar to multipolar. To some extent, multipolarization has good news and bad news. For the good news is that, maybe a multipolar world is more balanced than a unipolar world. Instead of being dictated by one single power, several major powers or power centers, they can help to stabilize the international system. So that's the good news. The bad news is that we experienced the multipolar world in the past. For example, before World War II, that was a multipolar world. And there was the war and conflict among the major powers, including First World War and Second World War. So today, once again, we are heading toward a multipolar world. And there comes with it two scenarios in my observation. One is, as we saw in the past, heightened geopolitical rivalry that would disrupt international cooperation and undermine global governance. For example, during Trump's first term, he launched the so-called strategic competition with China, which to some extent is a typical major power rivalry that we saw many times in the history. And this kind of major power competition, of course, would damage international cooperation and global governance. However, there is another possibility, which is a reformed and reinvigorated international system capable of producing enhanced great power cooperation and more effective global governance. Because when the world relies on more rather than one actor to sustain its operation, maybe we can improve the current international system and secure more resources in pushing the common international agenda. So that is another possibility. Now, which scenario will take place in the future is not predetermined. It depends on what we do in this transitional period. What I'm going to do next is to share with you my idea about how we can do to secure the second better scenario for our world today and in the future. Now, when I talk about pragmatic multilateralism, what does this mean? This is a concept drawing from both realist and liberal lines of thinking. In international relations, we have two major schools of thought, right? Realism and liberalism. And in the last 30 years, since the end of Cold War, we relied mostly on liberalism in promoting globalization and global governance. And before the end of Cold War, during the Cold War era, we relied mostly on realism. Now this is a time that we have to combine both realism and liberalism. So this pragmatic multilateralism first draws from realism. In realism, it cares about two things. One is the power balance, to say how the major powers balance their capabilities. This is the most important thing. Which country is strong, which is weak. The second is the national interest, because for all countries, they pursue their national interests. So we should take into consideration both balance of power as well as the balance of interest. In a real world, that is what we are supposed to do. So that is what we try to get from the realist thinking. And also, when you think about national interests, that doesn't mean all the major powers should be selfish. No, they should try to cooperate and coordinate. And how can they achieve that? It depends on a strategic understanding or strategic accord. Realism believes cooperation is difficult, but not impossible, as long as the major powers can strike some kind of strategic understanding, and cooperation is possible. So I think if major players like China and US can strike a grand bargain, then Beijing and Washington can cooperate on many issues. And indeed, in the 70s and 80s, China and the US did reach a strategic consensus, and we cooperated on some major issues during the Cold War era. So that happened before. So basically, the realist notion of power sharing, interest sharing, and burden sharing would make states work with rather than against each other in a multipolar world. So in a multipolar world, major powers can still cooperate. So that is my take of realism, the realist part for multilateralism. Now, for the liberal part, liberalism always talk about, how you make international cooperation happen. Basically, it relies on international institutions like the United Nations or World Bank, and also the rules and norms that are commonly observed. So for us to talk about pragmatic multilateralism, it needs to learn from liberalism that today in a multipolar world, how international institutions, rules, and norms play their role in dealing with relations among countries. And basically, pragmatic multilateralism means in a multipolar world, pragmatic multilateralism envisions an international order based on two things. One is a sound balance of power. Another is strong international institutions. This order will effectively temper inevitable major power rivalry and facilitate necessary cooperation among states. So that is my concept about pragmatic multilateralism. This may sound a little bit, abstract to you, and now I'm going to take to the a more concrete level to explain how to make this happen. I think to make this happen, we have to develop three pillars. One is a grand bargain between China and the United States, major powers. Second is to reform and reinvigorate international system, like the United Nations. Third, a constructive role by the key third-party actors, such as Europe, Russia, Japan, India, and ASEAN, among others. Now let me go quickly over each of them to explain what I mean. First and foremost is Sino-US grand bargain. Some people say, actually today is not multipolar, it's bipolar, China-US, which in my opinion is not the case. However, China-US relations really hold the key to the future of the international system. Now, if we are going to make China-US dynamics useful for a multipolar world, first and foremost, Beijing and Washington should figure out how to secure a peaceful coexistence. When Donald Trump launched strategic competition with China in his first term, some people in his national security team, their purpose was to defeat China and even bring about regime change in China. That's not coexistence. That would lead to head-on conflict between our two countries. Now, during the Biden administration, his national security team gradually realized that neither US nor China can defeat the other side. So these two countries have to figure out how to coexist in the long term. So that's the one sentence, coexistence. Not expect the other side to collapse or to disappear in the foreseeable future. And the second thing is that China and US have to live within the same international system. Like it or not, US is still, very much the founding father of the current international system, even though, Donald Trump and many MAGA people, they say, okay, US suffered from the current international system. U.S. is just the victim of the international system. That's not true. U.S. is the founder of the current international system, which to a large extent has benefited the U.S. dramatically. U.S. has been a major beneficiary. And for China, China is also a major beneficiary of the current international system since China launching the opening and reform campaign in late 70s and early 80s. So for China and the U.S., we have more to lose than to gain if the current international system just collapses. So Beijing and Washington should realize, although this system is not perfect, but we need to sustain it. So that's the first thing when I talk about China-U.S. grand bargain. They should learn how to coexist in the same international system. Of course, this system is evolving, not static. Second is China and the U.S. should come up with a cooperative international agenda. Now, think about it in 1970s or 80s. After Nixon opened the door to China, and China and the U.S. decided to cooperate on issues like containing Soviet expansion, right? And also dealing with some regional issues. We did have a common and cooperative agenda at that time. Now, what will the cooperative international agenda look like today for China-U.S.? I think there are several levels. The first level is China-U.S. cooperation on transnational issues like climate change, public health, environmental degradation, and also transnational crimes like drug trafficking. At least that is one issue Donald Trump cares about, right? Fentanyl, illegal immigrants. So that is level one, that China-U.S. should cooperate. Level two has to do with the regional conflicts, be it Gaza conflict or Russia-Ukraine conflict, internal civil war in Myanmar, the problem on the Korean Peninsula, and those in Africa, Sudan, etc. So China-U.S. as two permanent members of the UN Security Council should cooperate in managing those regional hotspots. Third level has to do with we should provide public goods to developing countries as they strive to achieve the UN development agenda, outline 2030 development agenda. So China, U.S. have been two major providers of international aid and assistance to many of the developing countries, even though Donald Trump is cutting down, but China is still providing those international assistance. I think two countries should continue to do that along with other countries, especially Japan and Europe. So that is the third. And finally, these two countries should also work together to reform the existing multilateral institutions like the United Nations, World Bank, IMF, to make them more representative and more efficient, which I will talk about later. So we need to come up with this kind of cooperative agenda between China and U.S. The last but not least for this agenda is Taiwan question. When Nixon came to China in 1972, U.S. formally embraced one China policy. That's about Taiwan issue. But today, some people in Washington, they tried to change the one China policy and go back to the Cold War era before Nixon's trip to China, which would make every cooperation effort impossible between China and U.S. Now, what the U.S. and China need to do on the Taiwan question is U.S. should reconfirm its commitment to one China and support the peaceful reunification of China and categorically oppose Taiwan independence. For China, it should express this kind of patience with reunification, and we are recommit to the peaceful approach to the Taiwan issue. So by doing that, we can somehow avoid a rising standoff between two countries across the Taiwan Strait. So that is about the Taiwan issue. So all these three will make a Sino-US grand bargain possible. I mean, you can put more in this category, but I think these are three major parts. Now, another pillar for pragmatic multilateralism is how to reform and reinvigorate international system. First, as I mentioned, we need to reform the UN, WTO, IMF, and World Bank. These, basically were institutions, most of them created after World War II, already 80 years, except for WTO, which founded in 1995, still already 30 years old. And these institutions today need to be improved, not only to make them more representative, but also to improve its efficiency. And second is making the global governance system more open and inclusive. What does this mean? Today we have many more multilateral institutions like Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, ARIB, like Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which deals with security cooperation in Euro-Asia region. And there are also, BRICS and New Development Bank, many multilateral and regional security and economic institutions, which should be brought into this international governance system. Because, as I mentioned, the UN, WTO, IMF, and World Bank, they are running deficiencies in delivering on global governance. So we just need more fresh blood from those emerging multilateral and regional institutions. Last but not least is to reform the norms and rules, making sure they are fairer, more just, and also universally observed. Now, I give you one example. For example, in IMF, the US is the only member that has a veto power. That's not fair. And also, the head of World Bank, governor of World Bank, the president, is always an American citizen, while the governor of IMF is always an European. It has been the case in the last 80 years. That's not fair. Why not people from Asia, Africa, Latin America to lead those multilateral institutions? So in the future, the leaders of those institutions should be selected on the basis of merit rather than nationality. Asians, Africans, Latin Americans, they have this qualification to lead those multilateral institutions. And also, if you think about U.S. behavior in multilateral institutions, it has been very selective. Just think about Iraq war, right? U.S. didn't go through the UN. U.S. invaded Iraq without UN authorization. That means from time to time, the U.S. just, evade the multilateral institution that it helped create after World War II. So if the U.S. as the founder of those institutions has been adopting a very selective approach to those institutions, how can you persuade other countries, other major players, to play by the rules? So I think the major powers, particularly the U.S., should improve its record in this regard, even though I know that is very difficult in the Trump second term. But let's take a long-term perspective on these issues. So that is the second pillar. The third pillar for multilateral, pragmatic multilateralism is all these third-party actors, the key third-party actors, should contribute to international cooperation and global governance. I think Europe is the single most important third party when we talk about global governance. Not only because of its economic weight, but also, Europe has long viewed itself as a normative power of international cooperation and global governance. So Europe should continue to embrace globalization, global governance, and multilateralism in a time when the US is turning the other way around. So Europe is really important if we are going to build a new coalition of multilateralism. And the concern is that the domestic politics in some European countries are turning those countries more protectionist, more conservative, more right-wing oriented. Next is Russia. Russia, to some extent, is a major victim of the current international system because the collapse of Soviet Union. And then in the last 30 years, geopolitically, the NATO expansion had, squeezed Russia's geopolitical space in Europe. And economically, Russia has not been a major beneficiary of globalization. So Russia does not necessarily have a high stake in the current international system. However, after the end of the Russia-Ukraine war, I think we still have to make joint efforts to make sure Russia, as a member of G20 and used to be a member of G8, still needs to play an active role in multilateral cooperation because of its geopolitical position, its military weight, and also as a major energy exporting country. So at least Russia should not be a major disruptor of the international system. So Russia is relevant. And I will skip Japan and India given the limit of time, but I will talk about ASEAN because this is in Singapore. I think ASEAN is very much important today in Sino-US competition because, Washington has been trying to woo ASEAN countries into its own orbit, but most, if not all of them, if not all the ASEAN members, have decided not to take sides. I think that is very important. If ASEAN countries take sides, what would happen? You will see the rupture, the splitting up of ASEAN as a regional organization. Some will, lean toward Washington, some will lean to Beijing, and ASEAN will be, divided. And secondly, I think if ASEAN taking sides, somehow that will exacerbate Sino-US geopolitical competition in this region. Because, as I said, some countries will join Washington in containing and balancing China, and some will join China against US and some other Asian countries. So this geopolitical rivalry will intensify in Southeast Asia, which was very much the case during the Cold War era. So by deciding not to take sides between China and US, ASEAN has managed to maintain its own centrality, ASEAN centrality. That's in the interest of ASEAN countries. Like the US in the last several years has pushed for the Indo-Pacific strategy. But this, if you look into this US Indo-Pacific strategy, that is a regional agenda dominated by how to balance and contain a rising China. And ASEAN has no centrality in this strategy. ASEAN has to solve the strategic purpose of the US in this region. So that's not in ASEAN's interest. And secondly, by deciding not to take sides, ASEAN can work to mitigate actually Sino-US competition in this region. I think some Asian countries have told both Beijing and Washington that you need to, cool down in your competition, or tell Washington privately saying, well, you may push too much in this kind of sanctions, technological sanctions against China, or tariff war against China. So by deciding not to take sides, ASEAN can play a more constructive role in Sino-US competition. So these are the three pillars for pragmatic multilateralism. Now, to conclude, first, as I mentioned, the transformation from unipolarity to multipolarity carries with it both high risks and great opportunities. The future is uncertain. Whether we are going to have a more prosperous, secure, and multipolar and cooperative multipolar world, or we are going to have a more divided, antagonistic multipolar world. The answer is, I don't know, depending on what we are going to do in the next decade. Second is, a bright future for a multipolar world depends on multilateralism anchored by a sensible Sino-US strategic bargain buttressed by empowered multilateral institutions and assisted by other responsible key players. So the three pillars, as I just introduced, are holding the key for a bright future for a multipolar world. And finally, the most important thing is that major powers, China, US, and other, Russia, they should embrace a pattern of behavior featuring self-restraint, coordination, and cooperation in a more competitive and fragmented world. Now, even during the Cold War era, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Washington and Moscow realized that if they were going to avoid mutually reassured mutual destruction, they need learn how to coexist by developing arms control crisis avoidance mechanisms. So today, after the outbreak of Russia-Ukraine war in Europe, and faced with tension between China and US across the Taiwan Strait, I think the major powers should take one step back and think about how we should exercise self-restraint and pursue more strategic coordination and cooperation, even though this is going to be a more competitive and fragmented world, as the US is no longer the only hegemon that can provide hegemonic stability, as we saw, in the post-Cold War era. So with that, I may stop here.